What happens when silence is mistaken for weakness, and a child's dignity is treated like an inconvenience? On a routine flight where luxury is expected but fairness is optional, a young black boy in a wheelchair boards with his mother, hoping only to be treated like any other passenger. But some people, blinded by status and prejudice, see him as nothing more than a disruption. She doesn't ask his name. She doesn't wonder about his story. She only sees a seat she believes should belong to someone else. What she doesn't see is the storm quietly building at 30,000 feet. This is not just a journey, it's a test of humanity, and every decision will carry a price. If you believe respect isn't a privilege but a right, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And which moment made your heart stop? At Gate 4A, as the final boarding group was called, Angela Thompson calmly wheeled her 9-year-old son, Eli, through the line reserved for first-class passengers. Dressed neatly in a pale blue dress shirt and black slacks, Eli sat upright in his customized wheelchair, hands folded in his lap, eyes quietly watching the people around him. His legs, limp and strapped securely with a soft harness, remained motionless, just as they had been since the accident that left him paralyzed from the waist down. There was no fuss, no complaints, only stillness and a trace of anticipation in his young face. When they reached the gate podium, Angela smiled politely and handed over 2 first-class boarding passes to the flight attendant standing stiffly behind the counter. The woman, tall and sharply dressed in a crisp navy uniform, had her blonde hair pulled back into a strict bun and wore a gold-plated name tag that read Karen Monroe. Karen glanced at the passes, her expression unreadable, until her eyes fell to the wheelchair, and something behind her gaze changed. "Are you traveling with medical equipment?" she asked, her tone clipped and vaguely irritated, as if Angela had brought a malfunctioning appliance to the gate. Angela answered evenly, "My son uses a wheelchair, yes. Everything's been arranged in advance. We're in first class." Karen nodded once, not quite meeting Angela's eyes, and tapped her tablet as if verifying a technical anomaly. Then she leaned into her radio and said quietly but clearly enough for Angela to catch, "Gate 4A. First-class passenger with unregistered medical device. Possible obstruction. Confirm compatibility." Her words felt sterile, mechanical, and deeply dehumanizing. Angela kept her expression neutral, but Eli shifted in his chair slightly, eyes darting away from Karen's piercing stare. Karen lowered the tablet and forced a smile that barely curled her lips. "We weren't informed about any special equipment," she said, glancing toward the plane's entrance. "The first-class cabin is quite tight. Your son might feel more comfortable in economy near the bulkhead seats. More space, fewer obstacles." Angela calmly replied, "He's not an obstacle. He's a paying passenger. He'll be comfortable in the seats we booked." Karen's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she responded, "Of course, if that's your choice." Her words hung in the air like a veiled warning. Angela wheeled Eli forward through the jet bridge, her back straight, her voice steady, but her knuckles whitened slightly around the chair's handle. Eli said nothing. He never did in moments like this. Inside the aircraft, another attendant greeted them with a bright voice and guided them to seats 2A and 2B. The first-class cabin was serene, with wide seats, soft lighting, and the faint scent of fresh leather. Angela began the familiar transfer, unstrapping Eli, carefully lifting him from the chair, and settling him into the window seat. She folded the wheelchair, stowed it per crew instructions, and sat beside her son, adjusting the seat belt across his waist. Just as they settled in, Karen entered the cabin and halted at the front, her eyes quickly finding Eli like a sensor locked onto a heat signature. She approached slowly, scanning the cabin as if inspecting it for violations. "Make sure the harness is secure," she said, directing her voice to no one in particular. "We can't risk complications mid-air." Angela gave no reply, and neither did Eli, who now stared out the window, lips pressed together. Karen lingered for another second, then turned sharply and walked toward the galley. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard and preparing for takeoff. Eli remained silent, his posture stiff. Angela reached out and touched his arm gently. "You good?" she whispered. Eli gave a small nod, but didn't look away from the glass. The plane began taxiing, and as it did, Karen passed through the aisle distributing menus, placing each one gracefully onto passengers' tray tables, except for Eli's. She stopped, stared at him for a moment, then placed the menu on Angela's table, without a word. When Angela raised her eyes questioningly, Karen smiled flatly and said, "I wasn't sure if he'd be reading the options." Angela bit the inside of her cheek, said nothing, and opened the menu for her son to read. Eli leaned slightly toward her and studied the page. He didn't speak, but he pointed toward one of the options. Angela nodded and memorized it. Not long after takeoff, Karen began circulating hot towels. As she neared their row, she handed one to Angela, then looked at Eli and hesitated. "Do I need to help with his hands?" she asked, her voice laced with exaggerated patience. "Or can he manage?" Angela replied softly, "He's perfectly capable." Karen offered the towel with 2 fingers, as if afraid to get too close. Eli took it slowly, wiped his hands, then returned the towel to the offered tray without looking up. As lunch service began, Karen returned with 2 trays. She placed Angela's tray gently in front of her, then paused over Eli's. "We only had one of the kids' meals left," she said. "He may have to share with you." Angela frowned slightly. "That's not what I requested. I confirmed his meal in advance." Karen shrugged. "These things happen. Besides, he doesn't seem like he'll need much." The implication hung heavy in the space between them. Angela didn't argue. She simply split her tray quietly between them. Eli didn't complain, though he barely touched the food. As passengers settled into post-meal silence, Karen stood near the galley chatting with a fellow flight attendant. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried. "First class is getting crowded with exceptions these days," she muttered, not naming names but glancing in Eli's direction. The other attendant, younger and more reserved, looked uncomfortable but didn't respond. Karen laughed under her breath, shook her head, and walked away. Angela tried to focus on the view outside, but her heart sat heavy in her chest. Eli, meanwhile, closed his eyes and rested his head against the side of the seat. The faintest tremble could be seen in his fingers. By the time the lights dimmed and cabin service paused, the tone had been set. Eli had not spoken a word. Angela had not raised her voice. And Karen Monroe had made it abundantly clear, without ever breaking the rules, without ever shouting, that in her eyes, this boy did not belong in first class. The cabin settled into a soft, post-meal silence as flight attendants dimmed the overhead lights, casting the cabin into a golden twilight glow. Most passengers reclined their seats slightly, flipped through magazines, or browsed their in-flight screens, and a few already began to doze off under the gentle hum of the engines. Angela glanced at her son, who sat upright, his small frame still rigid, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She reached over and adjusted the tiny pillow behind his back, offering a soft smile that Eli didn't quite return. It was clear that the weight of the earlier moments, Karen's subtle dismissals and the uncomfortable stares, had begun to settle in his mind. He wouldn't talk about it, not during the flight, maybe not even after, but Angela knew the signs. His stillness wasn't peace, it was suppression. She didn't push him. She never did. Instead, she reached up to retrieve the blanket provided in the overhead compartment for his comfort, only to find it missing. Confused, she glanced around and flagged down a passing attendant, a younger woman named Rachel, who had earlier helped stow the wheelchair without question. Rachel smiled warmly and bent slightly toward Angela's seat. "Need something?" she asked in a hushed voice. Angela nodded toward the empty compartment. "We didn't get a blanket set. Could I have one for my son?" Rachel nodded immediately. "Of course. Let me check the galley." She turned and disappeared down the aisle with professional grace. Less than a minute later, as she emerged with a neatly folded blanket and a supportive neck cushion, Karen appeared from the opposite end of the aisle, intercepting her mid-walk. Their exchange was muted, but Angela could see Karen's eyes flick toward them, her mouth forming the words "unnecessary" and "standard allocation." Rachel hesitated, blinked, then responded with a simple nod before continuing forward. She crouched at Eli's side and offered a small smile. "Here you go, sweetheart." She placed the blanket within arm's reach and tucked the pillow into the seat's side panel. Eli gave her a shy glance, but said nothing. Angela whispered a soft thank you, and Rachel gave a reassuring nod before moving on. Karen, however, followed moments later, lingering beside their row without addressing either of them directly. Instead, she looked down at the folded blanket near Eli's lap and said, more to the air than to them, "We encourage passengers, especially in first class, to use the amenities provided independently. It's part of our policy to promote self-reliance." Angela turned slightly, keeping her voice low and measured. "He can manage on his own," she replied. "He just needed help reaching it." Karen offered a smile so thin it was nearly invisible. "Just making sure the expectations are clear," she replied, then pivoted and walked away without another word. Minutes passed, but the chill lingered more than the cabin temperature could explain. Eli fumbled with the blanket, managing to unfold part of it, but the bulk dropped to the floor beside him, half bunched near his motionless legs. Angela reached to retrieve it, but Karen reappeared almost instantly. "Please remain seated," she said firmly, not even allowing Angela to speak. "Cabin crew will handle anything dropped. Safety first." Angela looked up, her brow twitching slightly, but she nodded and leaned back. Karen leaned down, picked up the blanket with robotic precision, shook it once to smooth it, then placed it neatly over the seat divider, completely out of Eli's reach. "Let him try it himself first," she added, her voice honeyed but condescending. "It's empowering." Eli stared at the edge of the blanket dangling 2 inches from his fingertips. He didn't ask for help. He never did. Instead, he made a slow, careful attempt to reach up with his right hand, his shoulder straining awkwardly as he stretched. Angela sat perfectly still, her fists clenched under the blanket on her lap. After a few seconds, Eli gave up and leaned back, eyes still on the blanket, defeated but quiet. Karen turned and walked away, seemingly satisfied. The other passengers continued minding their own business, the soft clink of glasses and rustle of newspapers providing a thin background track. Most didn't notice the microaggressions. Some might have thought Karen was simply doing her job. But Angela had seen it all before, the patronizing tone, the false smiles, the subtle deflections framed as policy. They were the tools of someone who wanted to discriminate without consequence. Later, when the cabin lights dimmed further and individual reading lights flickered on, Angela gently nudged Eli. "Want to listen to music?" she whispered, offering him the audio jack connected to the entertainment console. Eli nodded softly. Angela reached for the noise-canceling headphones that had been handed to them earlier, hers in a sealed package, Eli's in a smaller, thinner pouch. When she opened his, the headphones were clearly older, with a faint crack along one earpiece. She raised a brow and pressed the call button discreetly. Karen arrived first, not Rachel. "Problem?" she asked crisply. Angela raised the headphones. "This set is damaged. Could he get a replacement?" Karen examined them briefly and responded, "That's the standard children's set. Adult models are limited. If there's a spare later, I'll let you know. But he should be fine with these." "They're cracked," Angela said, calm but firm. Karen smiled faintly. "We've had no complaints before." She walked away without another word, leaving Angela holding the damaged set. Angela didn't speak. She simply handed them to Eli. He took them, as he always did, without a single protest. He wore them like armor, fragile as they were, and turned toward the screen. At that moment, Rachel passed by again and glanced down at them. Her eyes caught on the headphones, then flicked toward Angela's face. Angela gave the faintest shake of her head. Rachel hesitated, then moved on. Even those who noticed often didn't intervene. That was the pattern. That was how people like Karen operated, just under the radar, masked behind protocol and policy. As the aircraft settled into cruising altitude and cabin activity slowed, Karen stood by the galley preparing warm drinks for a select few passengers. She passed out herbal teas and chamomile cups with careful smiles, yet when she reached Angela and Eli, she skipped their row entirely, citing a restocking issue when Angela looked up. Minutes later, however, The couple in row 3A and 3B, seated just behind, received identical beverages Karen had claimed were unavailable. Angela didn't ask again. Eli had finally relaxed enough to close his eyes, though Angela knew her son well enough to see it wasn't true rest. His lips were slightly parted, and his hands, resting loosely at his sides, occasionally clenched as if mimicking motions he no longer had control over. Angela glanced at the overhead monitor, which displayed their current altitude and flight progress, then reached down to retrieve her book, only to pause when she heard a sudden, overly cheerful voice coming from the front of the cabin. Karen Monroe stood in the aisle with a bright, performative smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone artificially warm, "we've got a little surprise today. For our junior flyers, we're going to have a quick, fun moment, something to make this flight extra special." Angela's brow furrowed slightly. She hadn't seen any indication of planned entertainment in the flight itinerary. Karen gestured toward a young blonde girl seated a few rows up in 1C. "Would you like to come up and sing for us?" Karen asked, already extending her hand toward the girl's mother for permission. The mother beamed with pride and nodded, and the little girl, maybe 7 or 8, got up with excitement. She wore a pink sweater with glittering letters across the front and bounced her way to the open aisle near the front, giggling as she stood beside Karen. Karen gave her a fake mic, clearly just a pen, and cued her in. "Go ahead, sweetheart." Something short and sweet. The girl launched into a cheery rendition of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," and a few scattered passengers clapped along or smiled at the performance. It was harmless enough on the surface, but Angela could feel where this was going before it even happened. As soon as the little girl finished and curtsied dramatically, Karen clapped a bit louder than necessary and turned her attention, almost theatrically, toward Eli's row. "And how about our friend back here?" she said, voice still syrupy sweet, but now unmistakably condescending. "Would you like to share something with the cabin? A song? A dance move? Maybe just a wave?" Angela looked at her son. Eli's eyes were now wide open, staring straight ahead. His body remained completely still, his breath held in tightness. Karen took a few steps closer, her smile firm. "Come on, don't be shy," she added. "Can you move a little for us?" The words landed like glass shattering on tile. Angela felt her stomach twist. Her lips parted, but she stopped herself. She knew exactly what Karen wanted. She wanted to draw them out, make them respond emotionally, give her something to label as overreacting. Eli didn't speak. His head turned slightly, just barely enough to face the seat in front of him, eyes blinking fast to fight back the tears welling silently. Karen waited 2 more seconds, then gave a shrug that said everything. Pity wrapped in mockery. "Well, maybe next time," she said lightly, then turned back toward the front. The cabin resumed its quiet buzz, and the little girl returned to her seat amid soft applause. Karen moved down the aisle, this time pulling a small navy pouch from her cart. "For our young travelers," she announced, "a little gift from the airline, a toy to enjoy until landing." As she approached each child, she handed out small plush airplane dolls or mini coloring kits. The boy across from Eli received one and immediately tore it open with delight. A few rows back, another child squealed over the bright crayons and activity sheet. Karen arrived at Eli and Angela's row, her cart stopping briefly, but she didn't reach into the pouch. Instead, she smiled and said, "I wasn't sure if this sort of toy was suitable." Angela's voice came out quieter than intended but firm. "He enjoys coloring." Karen raised a brow. "Really? With limited mobility?" she asked, glancing pointedly at Eli's hands. "These toys are pretty hands-on. We don't want to frustrate anyone." She began to push the cart again. "Besides, this isn't a therapy center, it's a flight. We have to keep it fair." Angela blinked slowly, absorbing the statement in full. Around her, no one spoke up. The businessman beside them pretended to be asleep. The older couple across the aisle avoided eye contact. Karen continued passing out toys until the pouch was empty. Rachel, the younger flight attendant, came down the opposite aisle shortly after and paused briefly at their row. Her eyes flicked toward the lack of toy on Eli's tray table, then darted up to Angela's face, searching for context. Angela gave a subtle shake of her head again, an unspoken plea not to intervene. Rachel nodded almost imperceptibly and moved on. Eli remained still, but Angela could see the change in him. The slight glimmer that had returned after takeoff was now extinguished again. He didn't cry. He rarely cried, but his breathing grew shallower, and his right hand clenched the armrest until his knuckles turned pale. She placed her hand gently over his. It took a few moments, but he relaxed under her touch. Karen reappeared one last time about 20 minutes later to collect trash. As she passed by, she paused and tapped Eli's tray lightly. "Nothing to collect here?" she asked. "No crayons to clean up?" Her tone was light, but the words were a dagger. Angela gave her a look, nothing angry, nothing sharp. Just tired, weary. But Karen didn't look back. She moved on with a slight smirk, as if she had won something. To her, perhaps, this was a game. By now, the flight was halfway through, and Angela had not raised her voice once. She hadn't filed a complaint, hadn't called for the purser, hadn't asked to speak to the captain. But she had taken mental note of every word, every gesture, every slight. And Eli, though only 9, understood enough. Understood that being silent did not protect you from cruelty, and being kind did not earn you kindness in return. He had experienced pity dressed as politeness. He had been made invisible in a space they paid to be seen in. As the plane cruised forward over the Atlantic, the next wave of humiliation was already quietly building. About an hour after the toy incident, Eli shifted slightly in his seat, discomfort written subtly in the way his right hand twitched. Angela immediately understood. She leaned closer and whispered gently, "Do you need to use the restroom?" Eli gave a slight nod, not wanting to speak aloud. Angela reached for the call button and waited. Karen arrived first, as expected, her expression unreadable and her stance rigid. "Yes?" she asked. Angela kept her tone polite. "My son needs to use the restroom. I'll need assistance getting him to the accessible lavatory." Karen blinked once and hesitated. Not long, but just enough for Angela to feel the pause. "We're not trained," she said slowly, "for highly personal assistance." Angela frowned slightly. "I didn't ask for personal assistance. Just help guiding him to the accessible lavatory so I can handle the rest." Karen looked uncomfortable, as if the topic itself was somehow indecent. "I mean, if he's not able to," she stopped, then changed course. "There's limited space, and we have to prioritize passenger safety. It's better if these matters are handled on the ground, before boarding." Angela inhaled sharply through her nose. "He didn't need to go then. He needs to go now." Karen stiffened, then said, "I'll check availability," and walk away. 10 minutes passed. No one returned. Angela eventually stood and made her way to the galley herself, calmly requesting the key for the accessible lavatory near the front. Karen turned from where she stood pouring drinks for 2 businessmen in 1A and 1B and said, "Occupied at the moment. I'll let you know when it's free." Angela waited nearby. The lavatory remained closed. Meanwhile, she noticed Rachel, the younger attendant, walking by with a small service tray. Angela called to her quietly, "Can you check if the accessible restroom is really occupied?" Rachel looked confused but nodded. Moments later, she returned and leaned in. "It's not. I just cleaned it." Angela closed her eyes briefly, then returned to her seat, biting back every word she wanted to say. Another 15 minutes passed before Karen returned, holding a neutral expression as she gestured toward the front. "It's free now." Angela helped Eli up, moving with precision, supporting him as he gripped her arms and pulled himself upright. He couldn't walk, but he could brace on her shoulders with practiced strength. It wasn't graceful, but it was functional. Karen stood nearby watching, but made no move to assist. As they reached the lavatory, Karen stepped aside only when they were inches from the door, muttering under her breath, "Hope it's not too tight in there." Angela didn't respond. She maneuvered Eli inside, adjusted his position, and closed the door. Inside the cramped space, she held back tears while helping him. Eli didn't speak. When they returned to their seats, Angela lowered him carefully back into place and buckled his belt. He was flushed with effort, but still silent. About 30 minutes later, as the lights were lowered once more for the evening portion of the flight, Angela pulled out a small bottle of water for Eli and placed it in the side holder. The cabin was dark, ambient light glowing faintly from the aisle strips. Angela leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment, finally letting her thoughts drift. In that silence, she didn't notice Eli reaching weakly for the water. His hand nudged the bottle, and it tumbled to the carpeted floor with a dull thud, rolling slowly toward the aisle. Before Angela could reach down, Karen, passing by again, spotted the bottle and paused. Without a word, she tapped it lightly with the side of her shoe, just enough to send it rolling further away, out of reach. Then she looked directly at Eli and said in a tone too light to be casual and too sharp to be kind, "If you can't pick it up, best not to drop it next time." Angela froze. Her chest rose slightly with a deep breath, but again she said nothing. She stood, retrieved the bottle without asking, and returned to her seat. Eli's hands were clenched now, not in frustration, not in anger, just tension. His body was sending out signals he didn't know how to voice. Karen, apparently finished with her comment, continued on. A few rows back, someone had seen. A young woman with curly brown hair and large headphones lowered her music slightly, her eyes narrowing as she tracked Karen's retreat. But like so many others on this flight, she stayed quiet. Angela offered the water to Eli and whispered, "You're doing great." He didn't respond, but he drank. It was enough. For now. Later, as the cabin prepared for descent, Karen made one final round through the aisles to collect blankets. Angela had folded theirs neatly and placed it at the end of the seat. When Karen approached, she took Angela's blanket first, then hesitated at Eli's, gesturing as if unsure. "Still using that?" she asked. Angela nodded. "He'll keep it until we land." Karen raised an eyebrow. "We usually like to collect early for sanitation." Angela met her gaze directly. "He's cold. We'll keep it." Karen didn't argue, but her silence spoke louder than protest. She took the next blanket and moved on. Eli sat motionless beside her, his shoulders slightly hunched, his head tilted toward the window, not in awe, but in quiet retreat. The blanket remained wrapped around his legs, and his hands rested in his lap, no longer fidgeting, no longer curious, just still. Angela hadn't seen that expression on his face since the early days of rehab, when he was still learning to live in silence, still trying to understand how the world would now treat him differently. But now it wasn't just the world, it was this aircraft, this cabin, and one flight attendant who had decided that presence in first class required more than just a ticket. Karen Monroe continued her rounds like clockwork, her voice honeyed with other passengers, her steps graceful and well-rehearsed. But beneath that thin veil of professionalism, Angela had learned to spot the edges, the tightness in Karen's jaw whenever she passed their row, the way her glances toward Eli never lasted long, as if sustained eye contact might make her actions real. It was all subtle, efficient, quiet enough to go unnoticed by most. And yet, as Angela reached for her water bottle and adjusted her seat, she noticed something she hadn't seen earlier. Karen was speaking quietly to the cockpit door, her body angled away, her voice low and purposeful. She couldn't hear the exact words, but from Karen's posture, it wasn't routine. Moments later, the captain himself, an older man with silver at his temples and a steady demeanor, emerged and joined her near the galley. Karen leaned in, speaking calmly, but with urgency. Angela could read the outline of it without needing sound. The glances toward their row, the careful, almost hesitant tone, and the way Karen placed her hand gently against her chest, as if explaining something deeply concerning. Then came the part that twisted Angela's stomach, Karen's brief nod in Eli's direction, followed by a slow shake of her head and a faint shrug, as if to say, "I don't know if he's safe." The captain didn't speak back immediately. He glanced down the aisle, his expression unreadable, then returned to the cockpit without interrupting the flight. Karen smoothed her uniform and walked away as if nothing had happened. But Angela now felt the shift, not in the air pressure, not in turbulence, but in energy. Rachel, the younger attendant, came down the aisle next, and Angela noticed a small envelope in her hand. She stopped at their row and, without meeting Angela's eyes, discreetly slipped a small laminated tag into the plastic slot on the back of Eli's seat. Angela's eyes narrowed. After Rachel left, she leaned forward to read it. In bold blue letters it said, "Requires special handling, delay expected." Angela's pulse quickened. She reached out and touched the card, then looked around. No other seat had a similar tag. Not one. She leaned back and exhaled slowly, gripping the armrest as her mind raced through possibilities. Eli hadn't spoken. He hadn't asked for help, hadn't cried, hadn't made noise. He had eaten quietly, moved only when supported, and hadn't once caused a disruption. And yet, someone had marked him. Not as a boy, not even as disabled, but as a risk. Angela could feel the sting rising in her chest again, not of helplessness, but fury pressed into silence. Eli hadn't noticed, or maybe he had and chose not to mention it. Either way, Angela didn't point it out. She simply shifted her body slightly, just enough to obscure the view of the sign from the rest of the cabin. Minutes later, Karen returned, her tone as light as ever. "How's our little guy doing?" she asked, feigning cheer, her eyes flicking toward the seatback label she had clearly authorized. Angela responded with a flat, "He's resting." Karen nodded as if satisfied, then added, "We just wanted to make sure everything is stable." That word, stable. It wasn't about comfort, it was about control, about keeping him from becoming a variable. Angela asked coolly, "Is there a problem?" Karen offered her signature, not quite a smile. "No problem at all. We just prefer to be proactive when there are elevated needs." She walked away again before Angela could press further. The humiliation was now systemic. Karen had escalated Eli's condition from inconvenience to liability, and now the cabin crew was treating him not as a child, not even as a customer, but as a precautionary footnote. Angela leaned closer to Eli and whispered, "You're okay. Don't worry about anything." He nodded slightly, his gaze still on the clouds outside, his silence now his only shield. As the cabin prepared for pre-landing procedures, Rachel returned and began securing the galley. Angela caught her eye, motioned discreetly, and asked in a hushed voice, "Did you put that card on a seat?" Rachel paused. Her eyes flicked toward Karen at the far end of the cabin, then back to Angela. She nodded once, reluctantly. "It was requested," she whispered. "They said protocol." "Is he flagged?" Angela asked. Rachel hesitated, then said, "Not officially. But when a crew member voices concern, it gets noted." "Concern about what?" Angela pressed. Rachel didn't answer. She just looked away and resumed her duties. Angela sat back, fists clenched beneath her blanket. She had flown for years, crossed continents, stood in boardrooms, and navigated healthcare red tape. But this was the first time her son had been labeled in real time, before her eyes, by someone who smiled while doing it. Eli reached for his water bottle again, and this time Angela handed it to him before he could try. His hand shook slightly, not from weakness, but from exhaustion. As landing time approached, Karen returned once more, asking if they needed additional deplaning support. Angela stared at her. "We'll manage just fine," she said, her voice sharp but level. Karen's smile held, but Angela saw the flicker of irritation behind her eyes. Angela sat upright, her hand gently resting on Eli's arm as he dozed lightly, the faint hum of the engines masking the oppressive tension that had thickened since the moment his seat was marked like a shipping container. Angela hadn't removed the laminated tag behind him. Doing so would only invite more questions or another false reprimand from Karen. But she had spent the last hour shielding Eli from the stares, intentional or otherwise, that seemed to linger longer with that label in view. Despite everything, she had hoped the last portion of the flight would pass quietly. She was wrong. Approximately 30 minutes before landing, the cabin stirred slightly as a late boarding commotion echoed from the front of the aircraft. It wasn't a technical delay, nor an emergency, just a high-status couple who had nearly missed the flight due to a connection delay. The man was tall, dressed in a designer windbreaker, and the woman wore oversized sunglasses despite the enclosed space. Karen greeted them at the cabin door with a glowing enthusiasm she hadn't shown to anyone else that flight. Her voice lifted a note higher, her posture straighter, her hospitality activated like a switch. Angela watched from her seat, already bracing for the inevitable. Karen led the couple into the first-class cabin, gesturing subtly at the back 2 rows where empty seats remained. The woman pointed toward the window row on the left, and Karen followed her gaze. That row was already occupied by Eli and Angela. Angela noticed Karen hesitate, her eyes scanning the seat map on her device, then glancing back toward Eli's seat. Her mouth twitched. As Karen approached their row, she smiled that performative smile again and leaned subtly toward the couple, clearly unaware or uncaring that Angela was within earshot. "The boys in 2A," she whispered to the man beside her. "Nice view seat. Front row. Quiet, spacious, but," she tilted her head, "you probably won't appreciate the view, if you know what I mean." The man said nothing. The woman raised her brows but didn't respond. Karen continued, "I can check if there's flexibility. It's not uncommon to make minor adjustments when there's special accommodations." Angela turned her head, her voice steady. "Our seats are confirmed. We're not moving." Karen's eyes met hers for a split second, the smile still there but colder now. "Of course," she said. "I was simply checking for options." The couple, sensing the tension, moved toward the rear without further comment. Karen watched them go, then turned and adjusted the tray table beside Eli with unnecessary force before moving away. Angela exhaled slowly, keeping her voice calm as she leaned toward her son, who was beginning to stir. "Everything's fine," she whispered. "Just a few more minutes." Eli nodded sleepily but didn't speak. Angela gently tucked the blanket closer around his legs and turned her focus back to the aisle, watching every move Karen made. The next moment came quietly but with a deeper sting. A young girl, perhaps 6 years old, walked slightly ahead of her parents, peeking curiously at the different rows as she passed. Her hair was blonde and neatly tied with pink ribbons, her clothes matching in soft pastels. As she paused beside Eli's row, clearly drawn by the blanket, the tray table, or perhaps just the gentle stillness of another child, Karen swooped in quickly. With a pleasant but firm grip, she placed her hand gently on the girl's shoulder and leaned down to speak. "This seat's not the right match for a little explorer like you," she said sweetly. "Let's find you a spot where you'll have more fun. That one's a little different." Her voice dropped on the last word, her tone unmistakably coded. The girl didn't seem to understand, but she allowed herself to be redirected without protest. Angela heard every word. Karen smiled and continued walking the girl down the aisle as if nothing had happened, rejoining her parents a few rows back with a brief explanation about safety and space. But Angela could see the pattern now, with crystal clarity. Karen wasn't just targeting Eli. She was also signaling to others, creating quiet boundaries between him and the rest of the cabin. He wasn't just excluded. He was being framed as incompatible. The flight attendants began collecting final service items. Karen passed by their row again and stopped, adjusting a napkin on the armrest that didn't need fixing. She didn't look directly at Angela this time. "We're just trying to maintain a smooth experience for all our passengers," she said softly, as if preemptively justifying herself. "Sometimes that means subtle shifts." Angela looked up and answered without raising her voice. "You've made your shifts clear enough." Karen blinked but said nothing, then moved on, her smile slipping briefly as she returned to the galley. Eli sat quietly, head turned away, eyes open now, though he didn't speak. Angela didn't ask him how he was doing. There was no need. The silence between them had become its own language, a shared understanding of moments like this, of comments that landed without raising alarms but left bruises anyway. When the final landing preparations were announced, and passengers were instructed to secure their belongings, Karen reemerged with a clipboard in hand. She walked down the aisle with a practiced ease, checking seat numbers, confirming details with murmured professionalism. But when she reached Eli's row, she paused longer than necessary, tapping her pen against the paper. "We'll need to make sure there's space near the jet bridge," she said aloud. "Wheelchairs sometimes block exit flow, and that's not ideal for first-class transitions." Angela stared at her. "His wheelchair is already arranged for arrival," she said calmly. We've done this before. Karen nodded. Of course, she replied. Just making sure expectations are aligned. Angela, however, didn't move. She remained still, her eyes fixed not on the monitor or the tray table, but on her son, Eli, whose small frame sat quietly, bracketed between armrests and wrapped in a blanket that seemed to grow thinner the longer the flight dragged on. His gaze was hollow now, locked in that place children go when they don't want to cry, but have no strength left to hold their head high. For a moment, Angela allowed herself to look away and exhale, but only briefly, because from the corner of her eye, she saw Karen returning with the meal cart again. Karen's movement was brisk, precise, and silent, as always, the wheels of the cart humming softly over the carpet. She stopped just short of row 2, where Eli sat, and adjusted one of the trays on the top tier. Angela noticed something odd. Karen's grip was firm, too firm. Her hand stayed clenched around the edge of the tray for a moment too long, as if preparing for something deliberate. Then, with a swift push, she advanced the cart forward, allowing it to swing tighter than necessary toward their side of the aisle. The metal edge of the cart clipped the footrest near Eli's seat. More precisely, the outer blanket edge wrapped around his leg. It wasn't enough to cause injury, but the jolt was noticeable. The blanket shifted, the wheelchair harness was nudged slightly off-center, and Angela sat up immediately. Before Angela could say anything, Karen casually looked down and offered a faint shrug. "Oh, sorry," she said, voice smooth. "I forgot he wouldn't have felt that anyway." The sentence hung in the air like poison. It was said without malice, without emphasis, just flat and factual, as if the comment itself didn't warrant emotional response. Angela stared at her, hands gripping the armrests, but she didn't reply, not because she couldn't, but because she knew what Karen wanted. Any word from Angela would be twisted, any emotional reaction weaponized. So she did what she had done the entire flight. She absorbed it for Eli. Eli didn't react either. He kept his head down, his hands fidgeting with the hem of the blanket. But Angela could see it, the twitch in his jaw, the way his eyes blinked just a little too fast, too hard. She reached over, placed her hand gently over his, and whispered, "You're all right. I'm here." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Karen continued with service, handing out meal trays to other passengers with perfect etiquette, complimenting wine selections and recommending the pear tart for dessert. When she returned to their row with the meal tray, she lowered it onto Angela's table with care, but hesitated with Eli's. "He's had a light appetite," she said aloud, not asking but declaring. "Should I skip his?" Angela's voice came out firm, unwavering. "He'll have the same as everyone else." Karen blinked once and nodded, then placed a tray in front of Eli with a mechanical motion, making sure the utensils clinked just enough to draw attention. She walked away without another word. Several minutes passed before an older man across the aisle, perhaps in his early 60s, motioned toward a flight attendant. He leaned over and gestured toward Eli. "He doesn't look comfortable," the man said quietly. "If it's all right, I'd be happy to switch with him. My seat's closer to the aisle, easier access." Angela looked up, momentarily stunned by the offer. It had been hours, 6 hours of complete isolation, subtle cruelty, and passive spectatorship, since anyone had acknowledged Eli with basic decency. Before Angela could even respond, Karen swept in from behind with a practiced smile, cutting through the moment like a blade. "Oh, there's no need for that," she said sweetly. "With his condition, every seat's the same. It won't make a difference." The man looked confused. "But if it would help," Karen raised a hand gently, stopping him. "Trust me," she said, "these requests sound kind, but they complicate protocol. We've already arranged for him to be comfortable where he is." She turned toward Angela and added, "Right?" There was a daring glint in her eyes now, the kind that silently mocked. "I dare you to contradict me in front of a witness." Angela looked at the man, her throat tightening. "Thank you," she said softly, "but we're fine." The man nodded, sensing tension he didn't fully understand, and returned to his seat, still glancing occasionally toward Eli with furrowed brows. Karen walked away slowly this time, deliberately, her satisfaction evident in her posture. Angela leaned toward her son again. "You're strong," she whispered. "We're almost done." Eli said nothing, but he gave the faintest nod, his lips pressed tightly together. As the flight approached final descent, the atmosphere changed. People sat straighter, window shades lifted, screens turned off. But for Angela, the atmosphere had never relaxed. It had been taut from the moment Karen questioned their presence at the gate, and it had only grown heavier with each interaction. And now, as Karen passed by one last time to collect trash, she stopped at their row, looked at the tray in front of Eli, and smiled. "Did he finish?" she asked casually. "Or should I remove it early? Might be easier that way." Angela paused. She looked down at the untouched meal, the silverware barely disturbed, the small water cup still full. Then she looked back up at Karen, her face unreadable. "You can take it," she said. Karen nodded, as if expecting that answer, and cleared the tray with smooth efficiency. Eli, for his part, never moved. The seatbelt sign chimed again, and the captain's voice crackled overhead with landing instructions. Karen offered one final walkthrough, pausing to check on first-class passengers and wish them a pleasant arrival. When she passed Angela and Eli's row, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The damage was done. The aircraft sliced through the sky at cruising altitude, and inside the cabin, a strange kind of silence settled. A silence not of peace, but of fatigue. Angela remained upright, her fingers gently running along the fraying edge of the blanket that still clung to Eli's lap. He hadn't moved in nearly an hour, his body a quiet statue, not because of his condition, but because of what he had endured. He wasn't asleep, only still, and the stillness spoke volumes. Karen hadn't returned in several minutes, perhaps occupied with final landing prep, or perhaps satisfied that whatever dominance she had sought to assert had been cemented. But as the aircraft coasted into its final hour, a different sequence began to unfold, one Karen hadn't anticipated. In the row ahead, a man in his 30s tapped away at his laptop, earbuds in, posture relaxed. His badge, clipped casually to his blazer, identified him as Benjamin Cho Systems Consultant, Orion Technologies. Orion, coincidentally, was a third-party contractor that supported Skylux Airline's secure in-flight systems. Benjamin hadn't meant to access anything beyond diagnostics, but a temporary Wi-Fi packet misfire exposed an admin portal while syncing internal logs. A tab blinked in the corner of his screen. Manifest update tier access clearance required. He clicked out of curiosity. The screen loaded a list of high-priority passengers, but only one name was highlighted in gold. Eli Thompson, Tier 0 Protocol, owner's son, full immunity, discretion mandatory. Benjamin blinked. He stared again. Eli Thompson. He remembered the name. 3 months earlier, Skylux had launched an international rebranding campaign highlighting inclusive design, and the face of that campaign had been a quiet, wheelchair-bound boy in a blue blazer beside his father, Ethan Thompson, CEO and principal owner of Skylux Airlines. Benjamin remembered the tagline too. The sky belongs to everyone. At first, he thought it must be a coincidence. Then he slowly turned around. 2 rows behind him, Eli sat in silence, his head slightly tilted, eyes half-lidded from exhaustion. Angela remained beside him, her body curled protectively, still alert. Benjamin's pulse quickened. He turned back to his screen and reread the manifest data. There was no mistake. Tier 0, executive-level priority. Any mistreatment of such a passenger wasn't just a service error. It was a liability at the highest level. Benjamin didn't know what had happened during the flight, but from the way other passengers kept glancing at row 2A and then quickly looking away, he sensed something had gone terribly wrong. He reached up and flagged Dean, the senior attendant. Dean, tired and distracted, leaned in. Benjamin whispered, "You need to confirm the identity of the boy in 2A immediately. Your system may be outdated. I just got into the back end by mistake." Dean frowned but didn't brush him off. With a nod, he walked to a side panel and accessed the crew's onboard tablet. He typed in the internal code Benjamin gave him, ETH001. The tablet vibrated once, then flashed a red alert. Tier 0 immediate response, recommended contact base. Dean's demeanor changed instantly. He tapped his headset, input a secure channel code, and spoke in hushed tones. "Cockpit, this is cabin. We've confirmed a Tier 0 identity in 2A. Requesting next step protocol guidance." A pause, then a curt reply. "Copy that. Confirm visual. Passenger under distress." Dean turned, looked toward Eli, and hesitated. Visibly unaffected, but has been isolated, possibly mishandled. The line crackled again. "Proceed with silent confirmation. Do not alert cabin. Will notify command." Karen, meanwhile, returned to the cabin from the galley, oblivious to the brewing storm. She made her way toward the rear, pausing briefly by the VIP couple she had previously tried to reseat near Eli. Her face carried that same mask of authority and charm. As she passed row 2, Dean intercepted her, casually drawing her aside under the pretense of seat readjustment. "Hey," he said quietly. "You remember the kid in 2, eh?" Karen smirked faintly. "How could I forget?" Dean leaned in closer, his voice flat now. "You should have." Karen's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Dean handed her the tablet with the manifest still glowing. She read the first few lines, and her expression drained of color. Before she could speak, a passenger 2 rows behind Eli, an older woman with a European accent, leaned forward and said aloud, just above a whisper, but loud enough for many to hear, "Is that the boy from the commercial? The one from the new Skylux ad campaign?" A man across the aisle turned to look. "I think it is." Murmurs spread like wildfire. Karen stood frozen, tablet still in hand, as Rachel arrived from the aft galley. She saw Karen's face, the passengers beginning to whisper, the tension breaking the surface. She stepped in fast. "Karen," she said, her voice hushed but sharp, "you need to come with me. Now." Karen didn't move. Her lips parted, her voice almost a breath. "That's the owner's son?" Rachel didn't answer. She just looked at her, and Karen understood. Then it happened. An electronic chirp from the overhead cabin screen, followed by a short flicker. It should have been a routine flight update, but due to the back-end sync Benjamin had accidentally triggered, the system momentarily defaulted to the internal manifest mode. On screen, for 5 full seconds in bold text, appeared, "Passenger 28 Eli Thompson Confidential Tier 0, Executive Identity Handle, with priority." The screen blinked again and returned to normal. But the damage was done. Silence filled the cabin. Not a dramatic silence, but a sharp, suffocating one. The kind that descends when everyone realizes something monumental has just happened. Karen stared at the screen as if it had betrayed her. Several passengers now turned openly to look at Eli, not out of pity, but with recognition, awe, and guilt. Angela didn't move. She didn't need to. She looked up, met Karen's eyes, and in that one glance, said everything words could not. Karen tried to speak, but failed. Her lips trembled as if forming excuses, but there were none left. Rachel turned to her, her voice low and final. "You pushed him, mocked him, belittled him. You crossed the line with a Tier 0. Karen whispered, "I didn't know." Rachel said, "But you knew enough to know you were being cruel." From the cockpit, the voice of the captain came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Cabin crew, prepare for priority landing procedure. Internal directive confirmed." The usual anticipation of landing was overshadowed by a shared, tense awareness. Something had changed in the air, something irreversible. Angela sat calmly, her hand still resting on Eli's arm. As the seatbelt light blinked off and the captain's voice offered a final courteous farewell. But she didn't rise. Neither did Eli. There was no rush. Their journey wasn't ending. It was finally beginning to be seen. Karen, still seated in the jump seat at the rear galley, had not spoken since being removed from duty. Her hands gripped the edge of her coat tightly, her badge now resting face down in her lap like a confession she couldn't take back. She hadn't dared look toward Angela or Eli again. The silence surrounding her wasn't passive anymore, it was suffocating. Dean stepped to the front of the cabin and opened the main door. Instead of the standard ground crew or catering team, there stood 3 figures, 2 in tailored dark suits and 1 in a Skylux command badge. Behind them, in clear view from the cabin aisle, waited 2 members of the company's security detail, not airport police, but Skylux's own internal enforcement, dispatched only in cases deemed sensitive to corporate reputation. They didn't speak to Dean. They simply nodded. Rachel approached Karen and spoke softly but firmly. "You're being escorted through a separate gate. Please stand." Karen blinked slowly, her voice finally returning as a brittle echo. "I was doing my job." Rachel didn't answer. She waited. Karen stood on shaky legs, picked up her tablet and badge, but Rachel extended a hand. "Those stay." Karen hesitated, then dropped them onto the jump seat and followed Rachel down the aisle. As she passed row 2A, she didn't look directly at Eli, but her steps slowed. Whether out of shame or stubbornness, no one could say. Angela didn't speak. She didn't acknowledge her. She didn't need to. The silence between them had evolved from tolerance to truth. The suited officials at the jet bridge met Karen with unreadable expressions. One handed her a sealed envelope. The other gestured toward a marked corridor to the left. She was led through a private terminal door, away from cameras, away from passengers, away from the cockpit she would never stand in again. The last sound she heard as she disappeared through the jetway was a faint, clear voice from a child, Eli quietly asking, "Are we home now?" And Angela, her voice soft and full of meaning, answered, "We're exactly where we need to be." Passengers in first class remained seated as instructed while the private escort for Eli and Angela was organized. Moments later, two company liaisons boarded, both wearing Skylux insignia, both offering genuine apologies, not in rehearsed language, but with bowed heads and quiet tones. "Mr. Thompson has been informed," one of them said, eyes meeting Angela's with reverence. "He extends his deepest apologies and requests to meet you both at your discretion." Angela nodded. "Later," she said simply. "Right now, I just want to get my son off this plane." The liaison smiled gently and signaled for clearance. The aisle was cleared, and for the first time that flight, the path ahead was open, wide, uninterrupted, and silent in the way only respect can create. Eli was helped into his chair by Dean himself, who handled the transfer with practiced care and a different tone now, a humility that could not be faked. Angela followed, her spine tall, her gaze unshakable. As they exited the plane, the first rays of morning light broke through the terminal windows, painting gold across the floor, catching in Eli's hair, casting a shadow that stretched forward, not behind. Outside, media vans had already begun to form near the executive terminal. Word had leaked, maybe through staff, maybe through internal dispatch, but the story was no longer just about a boy on a plane. It was about what he represented, who he was, and what had been done to him. Skylux released an immediate internal statement before the press frenzy could ignite. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for any act, intentional or implied, that violates the dignity, safety, or humanity of any passenger. The incident involving a Tier 0 guest has been reviewed. Appropriate action has been taken." The email that reached Karen's inbox exactly 20 minutes after touchdown contained no greeting, no summary, no soft landing. It read only, subject, "Termination of employment, immediate action required employee Monroe. Karen, following the conclusion of internal review and executive directive, your employment with Skylux Airlines is hereby terminated effective immediately. Your conduct on board Flight 512 violated company protocol, Tier 0 handling policy, and ethical treatment standards. Your access to all systems has been revoked. A formal investigation is underway to determine legal liability and further restitution procedures. You misjudged the wrong child." Karen stared at the screen, her face pale under fluorescent lights, seated in a debriefing room lined with frosted glass. The words on the message burned into her mind, not because they were cruel, but because they were absolute. There would be no second chance, no reinstatement. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had become the lesson. That afternoon, Skylux held a press briefing. Ethan Thompson stood at the podium, not as a CEO, but as a father. His voice was steady, though weighted with emotion. "My son, Eli, represents everything we believe the skies should be, a place where no one is seen as less because of how they move, look, or speak. What happened on Flight 512 will never happen again. We are expanding our training and launching the Dignity First initiative across all divisions. He stepped back, adjusted the mic, then added one final line without script. Sometimes justice doesn't shout. Sometimes it just lands. The crowd applauded, not out of protocol, but because they understood. That evening, Angela sat with Eli at a quiet hotel suite arranged by the company. The view overlooked the runway. Eli sipped his cocoa slowly, staring out the window. "Do you think she's sorry?" he asked. Angela paused, then replied, "I don't know. But that's not our weight to carry anymore." Eli nodded, then turned back to the glass, watching a plane lift into the sky. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful moment like this. What part hit you the hardest? Was it the silent strength of Eli? The moment Karen realized who he really was? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Let justice fly higher together.